When we try to sit behind the eyes, the mind runs wild. I get email after email telling me my mind is wild. When I meditate, start thinking of things that I never thought before. And I write back to them, you are not alone, we are together with you. We are all in the same boat. It's the nature of the mind. And that has been the whole thing, why we can't know where we really belong. In order to overcome this only single obstacle on our spiritual journey, on our quest for finding the truth about ourselves, the only thing required is to control the mind, to be able to put the mind in its proper place. The mind is not a bad thing. It's wonderful that it can generate experiences of time and space and make events happen and connect the events by cause and effect and create karma and create all these experiences of high and low. What else do you expect? It's better than any movie or any drama you can see. And we are creating all that right now with our own mind. It's wonderful. But don't let it tell you what to do. Therefore, that playful will that created the whole thing has now enabled the same playful will, has given so much will to the mind that the mind has assumed independent will. So there now exist in our head two wills. The mind's will and the will of the totality of consciousness, or we might call God's will. Everybody is beset with this problem. Am I living in my mind's will or am I living in God's will? They know the truth is, if you want to find God, you must live in God's will. If you want the truth about your own self, you must live in the will of the totality of consciousness, your own true self. Therefore, when we are accustomed to using these two wills, my will says, which I call spiritual will, says, I have to do this. It comes automatically. It's coming from there where I belong. Then the mind which has created this situation outside says, no, that's much better, you can do this. So I'm torn between two kinds of wills operating within me. And then I put my will against mind will. Normally, I have given the power to the mind, I should always win. As it happens, mostly I lose and the mind wins. What a state we have created that we ourselves have allowed the mind and the mind's will to win every time we want to fight with it. We have weakened ourselves and strengthened our minds. We have almost hidden our own spiritual will and strengthened the mental will with which we operate every day. It would be so much easier to go to your true home if the spiritual will could win every time over the mind's will. All this talk about meditation, repeating of mantra, doing the spiritual exercises, standing on headstands, standing on one leg in the river, all that stuff is only to create the superiority of the spiritual will over the mental will. No other purpose. The whole programs we make of spiritual disciplines and spiritual practices and yogas and so on is only designed to make the spiritual will win over the mental will. And yet the mental will keeps on fighting and mostly winning. So therefore we have to find ways how to make the spiritual will get back to its own strength. It's the spiritual will that created the mental will. And how could we be subjected to our own creation in such a way? But we have created this, so all our experiences that we are having is between the two, God's will, our will. How about changing our life? From this instant, let's change our life that we will always live in God's will and never in our own mental will. The mind will say something, we'll look up to God's will. Say, we live by God's will. Mind is so clever, it makes itself into two parts. And when we are thinking, it says, this is my will, this is God's, see? And do it. And we get so confused. Is it God's will or is it mind's will? There are two voices telling me, do this, do that. Both seem to be not really my will. Something else is going on. The mind then starts deceiving us in such a way, almost like it's a game we are playing every day. We are playing a game with our mind every day. And the mind is winning. What kind of game is this? And we have given all the power to the mind to win. When we say, what is God's will? It is not difficult to know. We have used different words and language today to show which is God's will and what is mind's will. God's will is to go with what has been created already, with the totality of consciousness creating through these different levels, whatever has been created outside, what they used to say, sometimes still say, go with the flow. When you go with the flow, keep your mind interfering with the flow, you are living in God's will. Jalaluddin Rumi was asked once, what is God's will? Isn't everything God's will? What we call mental will is also God's will. He said, that is true. But God's will has divided it for experience, that we should have the second will also. Where's the moj if there are no two wills? That's the moj, that's the playfulness. Therefore, he said, if you want to follow God's will, no problem. If God gives you a spade in your hand, in one of the Masnavis, he writes, if God gives you a spade in your hand, he has expressed his will. Dig. If you're given a pen in your hand, he has expressed his will. Write. If he has created an experience around you and given you the circumstances what to do it. That's God's will. If you dilly-dally and start thinking of some other things, that's mind's will. Now, how do you have God's will and mind's will distinguished between the two? The way we can understand better in the West, because we have good language to separate the two, is God's will is expressed to you intuitively. Now, in the old days, they didn't have the word intuition. So it's a good word. And mind's will is expressed rationally by thinking. Every time you have to think to make a decision, it's mind's will. Every time the gut feeling, instantaneous feeling tells you do, it's God's will. That's internal. External, what the circumstances are, you have a pen in your hand, right? If you are required to walk here, right? If you have a family, take care of them, right? If this is your dharma, duty, do it. That's God's will. So actually one can transform one's life into a life in which you are always living in God's will. Follow your intuition. What do you do with the mind then? If you're following your intuition, what's the role of the mind? The role of the mind is carry out what you have decided intuitively. Not that you ask the mind, what should I do? Which is what we have been doing all the time. You tell the mind to implement the decisions you are taking intuitively. And that's God's will. You will find that intuition, which comes suddenly, with no time, no space, from nowhere. Where is it coming from? It's coming from an internal self, from this consciousness itself. It's not coming from what is covered around it. Of course, if you have to deal with things that are outside, it must have some relation to what is outside. Yes, it does. When we reason, when we use the mind to think, we have very limited information on which we think. We can't see everything. We can't even remember our past. Forget past lives, we can't even remember the past of this life. How can we make good judgments with thinking when we don't remember anything? Whereas intuition remembers. Intuition is a result of cumulative memory of the entire universe and the entire time that you have ever been here. Intuition does not depend upon what is in front of you. Intuition depends upon your inner memory, where you have brought everything and which the mind has forgotten. So that is why intuition functions differently. It has no time, no space, comes instantaneously. It cannot be practiced. Somebody told me he had learned how to develop intuition. And I wanted to know, must be a new method, I'll teach to everybody, if I can learn it. I said, will you demonstrate how you develop intuition? He said, now look, I am going to decide intuitively whether I will drink from this cup of water or not. Not by reason, but intuition. He said, no, my intuition says, drink. I said, what was that before that? That's where the mind comes in. Every time you take time to say something, it is not intuitive, it is mental. When it's intuitive, there was no time. You didn't even have time to know where it happened. But the gut feeling says yes. Intuition is timeless. And yet, if people have lived in their intuition, I can tell you their whole life is much different, much better than those who have constantly thought about what they should do. Those who continuously think what they should do are regretting all the time. I wish I hadn't done this. Oh, I wish I had known this earlier. That shows how mind is functioning in ignorance. It can't remember anything and take decision. It doesn't know what has happened in the past. It doesn't know at all what is going to happen in the future. What kind of mind is that to give us advice what to do? At least intuition knows what happened, and intuition can guide us. The trouble is, we all have these gut feelings, we all have intuitive feelings because we are all souls. And yet we let the mind override us. The mind, we get a gut feeling, the mind says, no, that doesn't make any sense. You shouldn't be doing it. We don't do it. What happened next day? I wish I had followed my gut feeling. I hear this all the time. Because the two sources of wills are different. The intuitive will that I call the spiritual will comes from our soul. And the mental will comes from our mind. Mental will comes from the process of the mind. The mind's processes are very simple. Thinking, reasoning, putting sense perceptions together, making sense of things, applying logic to understand, putting different steps of logic to understand things, communicating, talking. That's all the function of the mind. And what is the function of the soul? Listening, seeing, intuitive knowledge, and experiencing love, joy, bliss, beauty. They're different functions. They don't even overlap. They're different functions of the mind and the soul. And we want to be spiritual, we should be with the spirit, with our soul. Therefore, once we find out the truth about how the system is working, the whole system of the operation of consciousness to generate experiences of various levels, once we understand the whole thing, then we realize the soul is all powerful and we have to pull ourselves to the soul. And what happens? Do we destroy the experience outside? If we have a different experience of consciousness, do we destroy the world to have that experience? Of course not. We just withdraw our attention from it. And we look at the other experience, then we can look at this experience. When we go to sleep at night, the body is functioning. We have a dream. We are in a different world in the dream. Our attention is all in the dream sequence is going on. We wake up. We have destroyed nothing. It is all there. Whatever the real thing is always there. So there is nothing to destroy. It's only a game of paying attention, of placing your attention where you want to have an experience. So by placing our attention on here and now and not listening to the mind, simple formula I'm giving you for enlightenment. Don't listen to the mind, use intuition for making decisions. Use mind to carry them out. Place your attention here and now and don't move from there. You'll get enlightened. What could be simpler than this? This is the simplest formula for getting enlightened. Enlightened means finding out that you are not this, but you are something in, and that inner self opens up other experiences more beautiful, more wondrous than these, more vaster than these. Vast ones, experience you have, which you can't have here. So, even the journey to self-realization, the journey to our true Godhood, the journey to our true self is so interesting. Mind is fond of pleasures. I know that. You all know that. If we can give the mind some pleasurable experiences while we are trying to get all this stuff, it will become very easy. Therefore, the first step is to go to a point where the mind feels happy. The mind feels, I want that. Otherwise, the mind keeps on saying, I want this outside. But if it can have something inside, that's a good first step. when we are in the company of a perfect living master and experiencing that unconditional love, the mind begins to love that. In the beginning, it's always looking for outside. But once it begins to taste that inside, and that's why we meditate and keep in touch with the perfect living master inside, who is always inside. Outside is an image. Outside the created image, because we can't see inside. A master comes, sits inside our consciousness. We can't see. He sits in our mental consciousness. We can't see. We close our eyes to see him. It's dark. So we open our eyes. He appears outside. Only reason for appearing outside. He's not outside. He's always inside. When he initiates us or accepts us as his friend, that he's come for us, he manifests himself inside. And then he's there with us all the time, whenever we are visiting inside. So that is why the best way is to make it a pleasurable thing for the mind itself, to go within and enjoy. Once the mind begins to enjoy, instead of being our enemy on our spiritual path, it becomes our friend. The moment you give good things to the mind to enjoy inside, it will go along with you. So that's one of the big steps to take. In the beginning, make your inner experience pleasurable, so the mind can be attracted and not fight so much with you. If you want to fight, eventually the mind begins to fight. Let's go meditate and go there. Why are you waiting outside? The very mind that is stopping us from going inside becomes an instigator to go and meditate and go inside, if it has tasted the wonderful things that lie inside.